Consent. And I should have record up there. So I'm going to try to do the presentation here. Does that show up on your guys' screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'll give you a little bit of time if you need to kind of do a half screen thing here. And like I said, I'll put this up again for in Google Classroom. All right, for you guys to go back if you need to. All right. So what this is essentially covering is section 2 of chapter 1. All right. So on Tuesday, we introduced a chapter just basically talking about civics, what it is, basic kind of like the with the concept of government and that. And then I was going to talk about kind of like in American government, the idea that we have this ideals and values, right? I gave you like 3 of the values being equality, was it justice, right? The idea here that we are also, in a sense, kind of like trying to reach these ideals. We don't always meet these ideals, right? Of equality, liberty, and justice. But we're an experiment, as kind of like early kind of American historians would kind of mention our kind of form of government. We're the kind of the first ones in what we call the New World to basically kind of throw off the yoke of monarchies, of a monarchy, to establish kind of rule by the people, although somewhat limited, if you will. So what section 2 is essentially, the first part of section 2 is kind of focusing on a little bit on history here and talking essentially about what is important to American democracy and kind of the American kind of social fabric, which would be immigration, right? And so your definition right there, the movement of people from one nation to another, those who leave their home country to settle in another country will be referred to as immigrants. The United States is often referred to as a land of immigrants. They would use that term melting pot a lot of times, if you've heard that before. The idea that we have, and immigration in kind of like this is an election year. Immigration is kind of one of these hot topic buttons here. But in a sense, the United States depended upon immigration. We would not be a nation without it, obviously. And we were a country at one point that encouraged immigration. And it was for our betterment. All right. So what we'll talk about here is essentially various waves of immigration and how they play into the role of not just American history, but American government as well. All right. Am I moving too fast? You guys getting this?
Yes.
Okay, because I can't see faces, so I apologize. So are you guys hearing my voice okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. All right. So in a sense here, while we are a nation of immigrants, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention how when we talked about immigration, there were already people here. So you could classify the first immigrants if you wanted to trace it back to what was essentially the last great ice age, would be Native Americans. All right. And Native Americans, according to the popular theory, although the theory at sometimes is tested, and you guys probably discussed this when you were in grade school, probably had a unit on this, on Native Americans, migrated probably from Asia, like kind of like Siberia in that area, across a kind of a connected ice land bridge called Bergenia, which is essentially the Bering Strait, which separates North America from Asia, particularly Alaska and the United States from Russia. All right. And so these, and within immigration and migration, we'll talk about push and pull factors. Pull factors are basically these things that kind of attract people. Push factors are people are kind of forced to leave for various reasons. Now, the theory is Native Americans came to what is the Americas and spread out from North to South America, primarily as hunters and gatherers. Right? They are nomadic or semi-nomadic, and eventually kind of settling in areas. Like just straight up the street here from the high school, we have Coquia Mounds, which at one point was the largest Native American settlement on what is the continental United States up until the early part of the 1800s. All right, this was essentially had a population maybe close to, and the numbers vary, like 50,000. All right, and so prior to what they call pre-Columbian, prior to the arrival of Europeans, the Cahokia, our area around here, was like New York City to a certain extent. All right, and so I'm going to show in a lot of these PowerPoints maps, graphs, and charts. You know, just to give you guys some ideas here on kind of visuals. I try to watch the MTVs, and I learned that you guys are into a few things. 1, trap music. 2, chewing gum. 3, chocolate milk. And 4, maps, graphs, and charts. So I can hook you up with maps, graphs, and charts all day, every day. The other 3 may be a little bit of a problem. All right. So this is the idea here. We talk about the kind of the land bridge that you see like right there, all right, that connected North and South America. So this is something you guys talked about like probably in grade school, if you will. So a lot of times they don't really kind of include this in the story of immigration, but the idea that they kind of like migrated and moved around. Now, the first Europeans to arrive in what is North America would be the Vikings, all right, which is a specific term for a people they refer to as the Norse, who mainly come from Scandinavia. All right, and so around AD 1000, all right, and around, you know, the turn of the millennia there, you had these Norsemen that traveled initially from Greenland to what is essentially Canada, Newfoundland. All right, they made a settlement called Vinland, which was a very short kind of lasting settlement there. But in the mid part of the 20th century, they were the ones that were kind of given the credit for kind of settling the first settlement, although it wasn't a permanent settlement in North America. If you in Newfoundland, they have a kind of recreation of the settlement itself. All right. So these are what they can refer to as the first kind of settlers, but not making a kind of long-lasting kind of impression there. So there you see the kind of the trajectory. This is the kind of the recreation of the site there. There was one historian, and again, this is only one historian that I heard, that said that probably the thing that was the downfall is that the Norse, the Vikings, probably came in contact with the native populations there and may have traded with them. There's evidence of that. Then one of the things they may have traded with them was dairy, was milk. I believe they may have had, I think it was goat's milk, and it may have gotten the natives sick. That was one theory. That was so lactose intolerance maybe been one of the theories that the Norse weren't able to make a permanent settlement there. All right. However, for as far as permanent settlements go, and what is essentially in the continental United States, the first Europeans to make kind of permanent settlements in America were the Spanish. All right. Well, you guys know probably from grade school, Christopher Columbus sailed for the Spanish crown. All right. Set in, you know, it's credited with discovering, although there was already people there. All right. Columbus never made it to what is essentially the continental United States, right? And even didn't get credit for like kind of naming the region. There was another, it was named after a guy named Amerigo Vespucci, who was another Italian who sailed for the Spanish a little bit later. The oldest European settlement that was established by the Spanish is still standing today. It's in St. Augustine, Florida. I've had some students in the past who've been there. At St. Augustine, there's a kind of a remnants of a fort. And then the Spanish actually ended up kind of losing Florida to the British. However, right outside of St. Augustine, Florida, was actually the site of the first black settlement called Fort Mose, which was made up of runaway slaves from Georgia and the Carolinas, all right, that were in British territory that ended up moving over into Florida. All right, so this is the remnant of the fort there. kind of what they call kind of an angled or bastion fort that's still standing today. It's a kind of a tourist attraction. So St. Augustine, Florida is considered in many cases one of the oldest cities in the Americas. All right. And so the Spanish also kind of colonized the American Southwest. Like go to California, there's a number of what we call missions there. Obviously, there's Spanish names for places like San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, all that stuff. All right. The other Europeans that made claims, particularly in this area, were the French, who claimed much of the Mississippi Valley in the 1600s. One of the oldest cities that the French established in this region is Cahokia, the city of Cahokia, which was established in the late 1600s. All right, if you get, there's still some remnants of the old kind of part there. St. Louis, obviously named after King Louis IX of France. You go like places like Dupo, which was initially Prairie du Pont. Fort de Chartres, which is just like in I believe Randolph County, was a French fort there. The British claimed much of the eastern seaboard, right, along the east coast there, with parts into kind of the Ohio Valley, in which they came in contact with the French, which led to a war referred to as the French and Indian War. The Dutch settled much as in the New York area. Probably the most famous Dutch settlement was New Amsterdam, which they purchased from the native population there and then sold to the British, who the English king named after his brother, who was the Duke of York, and that becomes New York City. Wall Street, which is the famous place where people trade stocks, and that was established by the Dutch. That's where the wall was, all right, for the city, or kind of surrounded it. All right, so you had Europeans. This is what they refer to as the Age of Exploration. All right, and so these were kind of places that were basically European settlements that were transposed onto the kind of North American continent. All right, and then we'll talk about in more detail how our kind of ties with the British and that kind of give us a lot of aspects of governance, if you will. All right, so these are the various settlements that the European powers had laid claim to. All right, and so Illinois was part of a region that was referred to as New France, that stretched all the way down to New Orleans. All right, so that was in the green area there. All right, so this is essentially, these are people that are kind of like, there's a pull factor to come to this area here. Many of these guys are coming to kind of start a new life, find fortune, various things. Now, there's other people that kind of in the story of immigration that were forced to this area, and that is obviously Africans. All right, and so as a result of kind of the Age of Exploration, a lot of these European powers were establishing large tracts of like farms and plantations. Unfortunately, many of the native populations that were initially enslaved died off from various things like smallpox and that. So that opened up the need for a cheaper source of labor, and that was Africans. All right, so many slaves were brought from what is referred to as the Gold Coast, or the western part of the continent. The trip that usually could take months was referred to as the Middle Passage. All right, and unfortunately, this is one in which Africans were treated as basically chattel, if you will. They were basically packed into tight ships to make this journey. All right, so the Middle Passage is part of what they refer to as a triangular trade, the trade between Europe, Africa, and the New World. All right, and Europeans kind of inserted themselves into kind of existing slave patterns that were established in Africa. All right. At one point, you had the country of Benin, the Kingdom of Benin, that basically held these, they called holding pens. They referred to them as factories where they would hold slaves. They didn't produce anything, but they had factories for Portugal, for Spain, for the British, for the French, so on and so forth. All right. This was a video that I can't play because it was in a PowerPoint presentation, but it was on the Middle Passage. All right, it was from Discovery Channel. So this is essentially the kind of the routes of slavery out of Africa in during the Age of Exploration. So much of this here, we're saying like 1500s and 1900, much of this was going to the Caribbean or to South America. Small portion of it was coming to the United States, but then you had a kind of issue where you had slaves coming from the Caribbean to the United States as well. All right, so this is, like I said, the African Gold Coast stretching from Sierra Leone all the way down to Angola. All right, was part of the slave trade. Just to kind of show you how packed these slave ships were. This is a famous illustration from a British slave ship called Brooks, which packed what was in the kind of the hull of the ship, which would have had about room for about 100 men. They packed something like 350. All right, the video would have showed you kind of a little bit more in detail there, all right, on that. All right, so that is a part of the story of immigration in which we see definitely kind of a push factor kind of occurring here. All right, now the kind of the real true first waves of immigration where we actually see people like kind of coming to the United States and almost kind of encouraged to a certain part occurs during the 1780s after the United States is established as an independent country, right? After the American Revolution. We needed immigrants to come here, though. All right, we were a relatively small nation as far as population goes. All right, now the majority of these immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe. All right, from places like England, from France, Germany, obviously, Scotland, Scandinavia. All right, and the majority of them were of the Protestant Christian denomination. You had Lutherans, you had basically Methodists, Episcopalians and that. The one exception were the Irish. All right, the Irish were primarily Roman Catholic, and the Irish came as a kind of their push factor. Many of them came poor, escaping famine. The most famous thing being the potato famine in the 1840s. All right, and unfortunately, many of the Irish were the ones as kind of like the outliers. Many of them were discriminated against. There's a famous, like there would be famous stories of signs saying, no dogs, no Irish, into like establishments and that. All right. So the first wave, like I said, is primarily Northern European. It's primarily Protestant, with the one exception of being the Irish. All right. Now, during the second wave of immigration, which is the late 1800s, early 1920s, happens roughly around the same time as industrialization is really picking up in the United States, where we start to see the large use of factories and machines to produce goods. All right. And so we were encouraging people to come to this country to basically fill that labor position. All right. So many of these immigrants were a little bit different. They came from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italy, like, Collinsville has a sizable Italian population as a result of this. Hungary, Russia, places like that. Also Asia, China, Japan, as well as Latin America. Now, for those coming from Europe, the majority, a large number of them, their point of entry was Ellis Island in New York. All right. Ellis Island was basically the kind of the station that was kind of established there as a place to kind of inspect immigrants coming in, make sure that they didn't have certain ailments and that, or radical ideas. And so this today, Ellis Island is essentially a kind of a museum, but this was the kind of the height of kind of immigration here. Unfortunately, you find many of these people that were coming in here, while they were kind of used as kind of like cheap labor, many of them were discriminated against from those who had ties to the first wave, if you will. So this is Ellis Island right here. There you see the famous Statue of Liberty, which was one of the first things that people would see as they came into the harbor there, all right, with the famous inscription, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." All right. And then you would have them embarking off of these steamships. Right, they would go through almost like a kind of a cattle process here. They would inspect, make sure that they didn't have ailments like trachoma, which was a very contagious eye ailment, cholera, things of that nature. If they did, they were basically placed back onto their boats. Now, in certain cases, those people were going back home, were going back to like warfare or famine or other kind of horrible situations. One prime example that would be Jews. We see a large number of Jews, mainly coming from kind of Eastern Europe, primarily Russia and Poland during this time, as a result of what they call pogroms. These were attacks on Jewish communities that basically were encouraged by like the Tsarist government in Russia. Jews had traditionally, dating back to the Middle Ages, been a kind of, while they were small communities, they were frequently persecuted. Obviously, the Holocaust in the 20th century was the crescendo of that. All right, was the high point of this, but Adolf Hitler wasn't the first one to essentially kind of target Jews. All right, and so in St. Louis, the sizable Jewish population out in kind of St. Louis, like kind of West County, and that many of them trace their heritage back to kind of Russia in this area. There's a Holocaust museum out there. There's a Jewish community center that was funded by Jews, many of them coming from Russia and places like that. So these were what we call anti-Semitism. We see the kind of so for many Jewish communities who had moved around parts of Europe, America offered a kind of a new start, if you will. However, there was still anti-Semitism in the U.S. All right, so you'd see like these are kind of cartoons. This is Teddy Roosevelt, image of Teddy Roosevelt, basically kind of chastising the Tsar of Russia for treatment of Jews. All right. However, what we see here in immigration, I don't know, we got a few more minutes. I'm going to try to knock these out. We do see a kind of rise of anti-immigrant feeling, which we still see today. All right, this concept called nativism, which believe that America should be preserved for native-born Americans. All right, and so Native Americans like Navajo and Cherokee and stuff like that would be like, oh yeah, I'm for. Oh, you're not talking about us. Never mind. These were the people that primarily had their ties to the first wave of immigration. Those who mainly were kind of like Protestant, Northern European, if you will. All right, there was a political party that strictly had a kind of anti-immigrant platform called the American Party, if you will. But in history, it's known as the Know Nothing Party, because when people would ask about the party, those members would say, I don't know nothing what you're talking about, in the sense when it comes to kind of being kind of xenophobic or afraid of foreigners, if you will. There's a movie called Gangs of New York, which the main character is a member of the Know Nothing Party. All right, so they actually had a candidate run for president. All right, it was one of these political parties that died out. All right, it had a very small group of following, but they were vocal, if you will. All right, so this is again kind of hiding kind of xenophobia and jingoism in kind of the kind of American flag, if you will. All right, they had their own newspaper. All right, American Patriot. Some of these kind of cartoons there, like this was one making fun of the Irish, using tropes that would basically play on people's like fears and that. One group that was primary, and so after like the second wave, we start to see a little bit of pushback on immigrants coming into this country, and we start to see a kind of attempt to halt that as much. The first kind of act passed by Congress that kind of tried to stem or stop the flow of immigration, particularly from Asia, was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which halted immigration from China. Also later from Japan as well. This was renewed under various other names, mainly because these groups of people were easy to identify. All right, they had looked different, if you will. All right. However, though, the Chinese, like the Irish, were responsible for building much of the transcontinental railroad that connected the United States. All right. So you would see in newspapers and ads some very kind of anti Chinese sentiments here. This is actually an ad for a company out of Dixon, Illinois called Magic Washer that shows Uncle Sam kicking a Chinese person in the behind there, holding up the Chinese Exclusionary Act. Many Chinese kind of gravitated towards the kind of laundry industry. All right. Certain groups were kind of relegated to certain positions, certain jobs, if you will. All right. And then the crescendo of this, the height of this was the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. This quota essentially is a limit. So this restricted the number of immigrants admitted from any country to about 3% of the population that was in the United States in 1910. So if you had Italians, let's say you had 50,000 Italians living in the United States. There's more, but you would take 3% of that was living in the United States in 1910, and that's the number was allowed from Italy. It was very restrictive. So the second wave is usually kind of the end of the second wave of immigration is usually 1920, 1921 with the Emergency Quota Act. All right, and so was that? I believe that's the last slide, isn't it? Did I lose you guys?
We have one more.
One more. Okay, let me knock it out. You know, we got 9:30 here. All right. And then the Immigration Act of 24, we just basically strengthened the previous Immigration Act. It lowered it to 2% and then moved the census back to 1890. So that was a lower number of immigrants in 1890 than there was in 1910. And then you lower the percentage rate. All right. And so, like I said, the 20s are usually kind of the era where we kind of talk about the kind of the end of the second wave kind of ending there. So this was signed by President Calvin Coolidge in 24. All right. So we've had these kind of pushbacks on this, but without immigration, we don't have industrialization. We don't become the industrial power that we is going to lead us through the 20th century. All right. So on Thursday, I want to talk about kind of more modern kind of immigrant policies. We'll talk about DACA. So tomorrow, my plan is I'm going to send out an assignment, but you guys will get through the weekend into Monday to turn in, so you have a little bit of time. All right. So here, one more. I got to show you a picture. This is Coolidge signing the act in 1924. The guy in his over his right shoulder, right here, that's John J. Pershing, who led American forces in World War I. So it kind of gives some significance there because he's there. All right, guys. Okay. Well, it's 9:32. I've already taken up 2 minutes past your time. Turn those notes in, like kind of turn them in for a grade. I'll send it to you guys, and then I'm going to update the grade book at Skyward tomorrow. All right. You guys got any questions or any concerns?
No.
Okay. All right, guys. I will see you guys on Tuesday. All right. Have a good one.